Lecture 69, Leo Tolstoy.
She wanted to fall under the first railroad car, but the red bag, which she started taking off her arm, delayed her, and it was too late. She had to wait for the next car. She felt as if she were about to plunge into the water for a swim, and she crossed herself. The habitual gesture of making the sign of the cross called up in her a whole series of memories from childhood and girlhood, and suddenly the darkness that covered everything for her broke, and life rose up before her momentarily with all its past bright joys. Yet she did not take her eyes from the wheels of the approaching second car, and just at the moment when the midpoint between the two wheels came even with her, she threw the red bag aside, fell on her hands under the car, and with a light movement sank to her knees. And in that same instant, she was horrified at what she was doing. Where am I? What am I doing? Why? She wanted to rise, to throw herself back, but something huge and implacable pushed at her head and dragged her over. Lord, forgive me for everything, she said. So ends the life of Anna Karenina, the tragic heroine of the second and last great novel written by Leo Nikolaevich Tolstoy. Most people who read Anna Karenina for the first time know that it ends with the suicide of the heroine. But they may not know that this is also where the idea for the novel began, in the mind of the novelist. In 1870, not long after publishing War and Peace, Tolstoy told his wife that he was thinking of writing a novel about a high society lady who would in some way ruin herself. All he needed, he said, was the key to the main character. And as soon as he found that, he could readily imagine every other character in her world. Nearly 2 years later, fate put the key into his hand, when the mistress of a landowner who lived near the Tolstoy estate took her life by throwing herself under a train. As a local magnate, Tolstoy went to see the body, and the sight of it stirred him profoundly. Looking at the heap of bloody, broken limbs, he must have asked himself the very question that Anna asks herself as she waits on her knees for the rolling car to strike her. Why? Why would any woman do such a thing? Why would she suddenly throw her life away? It's the kind of question that only the imagination of a novelist can answer. And the answer, rich, complex, and endlessly fascinating, is the novel itself. The man who started writing this novel in 1873 had been born some 45 years earlier at Yasnaya Polyana, the family estate of Count Nikolai Ilyich Tolstoy in the Russian province of Tula. Leo Tolstoy was the fourth son of the Count, a lawyer and farmer, but the boy's mother died when he was just 2, and his father died 7 years later. Raised by various aunts and educated for a time at Kazan University, Tolstoy dropped out at the age of 19, when he inherited and then moved to the place that became his home base for the rest of his life, Yasnaya Polyana, the family estate. The young Tolstoy proved himself a progressive landlord as well as a gentleman farmer. In 1849, when he was 21, he opened a school for peasant children on the estate. But he was actually a restless young man seeking his true vocation, a playboy becoming a writer. During a visit to Moscow in the winter of 1849 and 50, he partied hard, but in late March 1850, he set himself to write something called The History of Yesterday. Influenced by Lawrence Sterne's Sentimental Journey, one of the many English novels that he read for inspiration, Tolstoy's history was a fragment narrated by a rather awkward young man who lives without an aim in Moscow society, ineffectually flirting with older women. But as A.N. Wilson observes, it is precisely in writing down his predicament and fashioning it into something which is halfway to being art that his aim in life, the aim in life of the narrator of this story, is discovered. Quite unannounced and sandwiched between social engagements of stunning triviality, Tolstoy's vocation as a writer had arrived, end quote, A.N. Wilson. Nevertheless, it took much more than parties to shape the writer Tolstoy became. He needed something like the kind of experience that gave Dostoevsky his profound grasp of human nature and human suffering. And so at the age of 23, Tolstoy accompanied his older brother Nikolai to the Caucasus, where he and his fellow Russian soldiers sought to conquer Chechen mountain tribesmen, something Russian troops have tried to do again in recent years. After seeing Nikolai's unit take part in a raid on Chechen tribesmen, Tolstoy wrote a story called The Raid. Published in a magazine in March 1852, it was butchered by the censors who struck out or mutilated, said Tolstoy, all that was good in it. Censorship was a fact of literary life in 19th century Russia. Under the reactionary and suspicious Tsar Nicholas I, Alexander Pushkin had to skirt all political questions in Eugene Onegin, 1831, commonly considered the first Russian novel. Dostoevsky was nearly executed for trying to launch a political newspaper. Nikolai Gogol was punished for exposing the corruption of government officials in his book Dead Souls, 1837. And just for writing a kind obituary about Gogol in 1852, Turgenev was put under house arrest. So Tolstoy's war story was allowed to appear only after it had been stripped of its troubling questions about the justification for war and about the feelings with which one soldier kills another. In short, Tolstoy was beginning to explore the themes that he would later pursue at epic length in War and Peace. In the meantime, he wrote and he fought. On the one hand, he wrote an autobiographical trilogy published in 3 parts from 1852 to 1856. On the other hand, he joined an artillery regiment in the Caucasus, was commissioned early in 1854, and when the Crimean War broke out in March of that year, he was put in charge of a battery defending Sevastopol while the British and French besieged it at length. This experience led to his Sevastopol sketches of 1855 and 6, with its vivid word pictures of the dead and the wounded, and ultimately it led to his first major work of fiction, War and Peace. War and Peace is at once an epic and a novel. An epic about Russia's struggle to survive the Napoleonic invasion of 1812, and a novel about 2 distinguished families, the Rostovs and the Bolkonskys. War and Peace thus combines 2 of Tolstoy's favorite themes, war and high society. But if War and Peace is an epic novel, Anna Karenina, his next major project, is exclusively a novel, the first I have attempted, as Tolstoy himself said. Its heroine is, of course, Anna herself. And while it tells the story of many other characters, its aim is to answer the question that Anna asks as she slips onto the railroad car. Why? How could she do it? What brings her to this end? Tolstoy said that he could not imagine any other solution to the agonizing conflict that racked his heroine, could not imagine any means by which she might avoid ending up under the wheels of that train. But Tolstoy's remark only prompts further questions. Did Anna really have to kill herself at the end of this novel? Was her tragic end all along inevitable? Let's see how the novel tackles those questions and begins to tackle them in its very first sentence. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. This is surely one of the best-known sentences Tolstoy ever wrote, and it's famous because, like the opening sentence of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, it makes you think. Much as we all want to be happy, we don't much care to read about happy people. What captures our attention is the unhappy family. Not just because we like to read about people in trouble and see how they cope with misfortune, but not just because this is the stuff of which almost all great stories are made, but because we know from our own experience that families can go wrong for all sorts of reasons, and their problems can lead to an infinitely varied number of consequences. In the well-to-do family of Prince Stephen Oblonsky, whom we meet in the very first chapter, the problem is adultery, a problem pervasive in novels of the 19th century. Let me risk a generalization here. As we move from the 18th to the 19th centuries, the focus of fiction shifts from courtship to marriage. And once the novelist shines the light of scrutiny on the married state, on what happens after the story of courtship decisively ends, adultery begins to rear its disruptive head. Of course, we find some adultery in fiction before the 19th century. In Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, for instance, where Tom dallies with several married women before joining his hand to that of the beautiful, single, and virginal Sophia Western. But in earlier fiction, adultery plays at best a supporting role. And unhappy marriages, like the marriage of the Bennets in Pride and Prejudice, furnish only the background against which single men and women play out their passionate quests for a mate. In 19th century fiction, the great question about love is not how to find a mate, but what to do with the mate you already have when you fall in love with someone else. Different heroines answer this question in different ways. At the end of Alexander Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, the first great Russian novel of the 19th century, Tatiana still loves Eugene, who once rejected her, but she firmly spurns his passionate appeal because she is now married. Other married heroines of 19th century novels prove far more pliable. Take Stendhal's Red and Black, published in 1831, the same year in which the first complete version of Eugene Onegin appeared. In Stendhal's novel, as we have seen, Madame de Rênal risks not just her reputation, but her very soul for the love of Julien Sorel. In Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, published in 1857, the heroine moves from one lover to another until the burden of debt and remorse and the strain of leading a double life finally drive her to poison herself. So Anna Karenina might be read as one more 19th century novel of a doomed adulteress. But if each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, as Tolstoy says, Tolstoy's heroine is unique. She finds her own tortuous way to the moment at which she leaps onto the train. Within the novel itself, the uniqueness of Anna's plight emerges by contrast with that of her brother, Stephen Oblonsky, and his wife, Dolly. In the very first chapter, we learn that the Oblonsky household has been radically disrupted by adultery. More precisely, by Dolly's discovery that her husband has been conducting an affair with their former French governess. But even though Dolly threatens to leave her husband and tell the whole world he's a scoundrel, we soon learn that she has no real intention of doing either, because she would not know what to do with their 5 children. So this particular story of adultery does not lead to anyone's death. Stephen's affair with the governess generates little more than tears and recriminations. Though he feels no repentance, he begs for forgiveness, and in spite of the hatred and disgust he provokes in Dolly, we are made to expect that in the words of Matthew the valet, things in the Oblonsky household will soon enough shape themselves back to order. They do so partly because Stephen and Dolly are aided by a woman who comes from St. Petersburg to Moscow to reconcile them. She is Stephen's favorite sister, Anna Karenina, and thus Tolstoy introduces his heroine. She's a grande dame, wife of one of the most powerful men in St. Petersburg, powerful enough to have placed Oblonsky in his well-paid job as head of a government board in Moscow. But, by a cruel irony, this grand lady who comes to Moscow to mediate between her adulterous brother and his resentful wife will thereby meet the man who will lead her into adultery, the young, handsome, rich, and brilliantly promising Count Vronsky. Vronsky is dangerously charming. He has roused the passion of Kitty, Dolly's beautiful young sister, who turns down a proposal from a good-hearted gentleman farmer named Levin because she expects one from the Count. But the Count makes no proposal to Kitty. Instead, he falls for Anna at first sight, and when she goes home to St. Petersburg, he follows her. From the outset, the pleasure they take in each other's company is shadowed by omens of disaster. Vronsky first sees her sweet, irrepressibly animated face at the railroad station, where he goes to meet his arriving mother, just as Oblonsky goes to meet his arriving sister, Anna. Moments after the two men greet the two ladies, they all learn that a watchman has been run over by a train that for some reason he had failed to hear. Almost weeping from the sight of the mangled corpse, Oblonsky can barely describe it to the ladies, and Anna calls it a bad omen. We could dismiss Anna's remark as so much superstitious nonsense, which is what Oblonsky calls it. But Oblonsky himself tells Anna how terrible it was to see the mangled body on which the man's wife had thrown herself. Anna's heart goes straight to this desperate woman. Can nothing be done for her? She asks. Vronsky answers the question by giving 200 rubles for the watchman's widow, a generous gesture that is promptly praised by Oblonsky. But in Anna's mind, the generosity of Vronsky's gesture is overshadowed by the horror of the accident. A very bad omen indeed. Much later in the novel, we will find ourselves asking about Anna herself the very same question that she asks about the poor widow. Can nothing be done for her? Anna starts her long journey toward this point of desperation by drawing Vronsky into a private conversation during a fashionable party given by Princess Betsy in St. Petersburg. Ostensibly, Anna sits down with Vronsky in order to tell him that he should go back to Moscow and apologize to Kitty for leaving her in the lurch. But Vronsky sees that this is not really what Anna wants to say. And when he asks if it's impossible for them to taste happiness together, she answers him with love in her eyes, even as her lips tell him never to say such words again. Vronsky's love makes her feel anew the ice of her husband's self-righteousness. When she comes home from the party sometime after her husband, Karenin, he warns her that her lively tete-a-tete with Vronsky drew disapproving glances and comments. In response, Anna says that her only crime was to be merry, not bored, which leads Karenin to up the ante. Your feelings are a matter for your conscience, he says, but it is my duty to you, to myself, and to God to point out your duties to you. Our lives are bound together, and bound not only by men, but by God. Only a crime can break this bond, and a crime of that sort draws down a heavy punishment. This is a profoundly chilling statement. Karenin may sound like a deadly old moralist, and Anna herself says that she doesn't understand him. But in echoing the very title of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Karenin articulates something very close to the moral of Tolstoy's whole book. In Tolstoy's moral universe, make no mistake, adultery is a crime. And while Anna is never made to wear a scarlet A or do public penance like Hester Prynne in Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, published 1850, she is nonetheless made to pay in other ways. When she and Vronsky finally consummate their love, her joy is nearly strangled by feelings of shame, disgust, and horror, and she cannot bear to hear him speak of their bliss. Now, at this point, you may be tempted to think that Anna's feelings of guilt and disgust are something thrust upon her by 19th century upper-class society, as personified by her rigidly moralistic husband. But Anna herself knows that some of the married women around her, such as Princess Betsy, for instance, are secretly having affairs without a care in the world. Why then is she so tormented? Why could she not simply leave her husband and run off with her lover, as Vronsky urges her to do when she tells him that she's pregnant? The answer to this question lies in Anna's son, Serezha, the 5-year-old boy that she already has by Karenin. She cannot run away with Vronsky because she knows that would mean abandoning her son and perhaps losing him forever. She was terrified, we read, when she thought of her son and his future attitude toward the mother who had abandoned his father. Karenin, too, knows only too well how deeply Anna loves her son and how he can use that love against her. When she tells Karenin that she has become Vronsky's mistress, that she hates Karenin himself, and that he can do what he likes with her, he takes no drastic action. He neither throws her off nor seeks a legal divorce, for that would require him to furnish witnesses to his wife's adultery, to drag his own spotless reputation through the mud of public scandal, and in the end, to throw his wife into the arms of her lover. What he chooses instead is neither divorce nor separation, or even separation, but something exquisitely calculated to maximize Anna's suffering. In a coldly worded letter, he tells her simply, "Our life must go on as before. That is necessary for me, for you, for our son. I am fully convinced that you have repented and do repent for being the occasion of this present letter, and that you will assist me in eradicating the cause of our discord and in forgetting the past. Otherwise, you yourself can imagine what awaits you and your son." Reading these words, Anna sees at once that Karenin is threatening to take from Anna the one thing she cannot bear to lose, her son. He knows she tells herself. He knows that I won't abandon my son, that I cannot abandon my son, that without my son there can be no life for me, even with the one I love. He knows that and knows I wouldn't be able to do it. So she agrees to go on living with Karenin and pretending to be his wife, even though they are wholly estranged, and even though Karenin knows that she is still meeting Vronsky on the sly. But of course, this bizarre standoff can't last long. At about the midpoint of the novel, when Karenin and Vronsky each learn that Anna is deathly ill just after giving birth, both men rush to her bedside. Though he had wanted Anna to die, Karenin kneels sobbing on her arm and feels ready to forgive everyone. Anna now sees that the imminence of her death gives her extraordinary power. When Vronsky approaches with his face in his hands, mortified by what he has done to Anna, she demands that Karenin pull the hands away, give his own hand to Vronsky, and forgive him, all of which Karenin does with tears falling from his eyes. The novel might have ended here, with the death of its heroine and the melting away of enmity between her husband and her lover. But Vronsky feels devastated. He's not just crushed by the prospect that Anna will die, but humiliated by the dignity and kindness of her husband, who has up to now struck Vronsky as merely pitiful and ridiculous. Vronsky, we are told, felt that the husband had been magnanimous even in his grief, while he, Vronsky, had been mean and petty in his deceit. Most terrible of all had been his ridiculous, shameful position when Karenin tore his hands from his ashamed face. Writhing in this humiliation, Vronsky puts a gun to his chest and fires it, but fails to kill himself, and instead survives, even as Anna contrives to recover. Somehow the experience of nearly dying and then regaining her life gives Anna the strength to make a painful decision. Resolutely refusing divorce, even though that would have left her free to remarry, she leaves both her husband and her son. With Vronsky and her baby daughter, she travels to Italy, where they rent a palazzo in a small, unnamed town. Here, Anna gradually forgets both her husband and her son. She knows, of course, that she has deeply wounded Karenin and should pay for her crime. She knows that she's supposed to be suffering from the ruin of her reputation and from the pain of being separated from her little boy. Nevertheless, in the first flush of her escape from her husband and from Russia itself, Anna, we read, was unpardonably happy and filled with the joy of life. The more she knew of Vronsky, the more she loved him. To possess him fully was a constant joy for her. But Vronsky feels something less than perfect joy. Cut off from his life as an officer and from the round of social diversions that filled his days and nights in St. Petersburg, he soon grows bored. So, after a brief fling at painting, he takes Anna back to Russia to live with him on his large family estate. Returning to Russia, however, means returning to all the problems they tried to escape. Going first with Anna to St. Petersburg, Vronsky makes a painful discovery. Until Anna gets a divorce so that she can marry Vronsky, society is closed to them. And not even his brother's wife can receive Anna in her house. At the same time, Anna feels an overpowering urge to see her son Serezha. But when her first effort to arrange a meeting goes awry, she knows that she must bear her grief alone. She could not. It did not want to share it with Vronsky. She knew that he would never be able to understand all the depth of her suffering. She knew that she would hate him for his cold tone at the mention of it. She knew that she would hate him for his coldness. Here perhaps is the first major sign that Anna cannot trust Vronsky to share her deepest feelings. So all by herself she contrives to visit her son secretly on the morning of his birthday when they are joyfully reunited, but for only a few tantalizing minutes, because she must leave the nursery before Karenin comes to see his son. In fact, the joy of their reunion quickly gives way to the pain of yet another separation. Soon enough, Anna finds herself back in the lonely upstairs hotel suite where Vronsky has installed her, while putting himself in a separate room downstairs. Yes, she says to herself, it's all over, and I'm alone again. Here again the words are profoundly revealing. Anna is not actually alone. She has Vronsky and her baby girl, But what she feels for her infant daughter is nothing like the love she feels for the son that she is forbidden to see. Furthermore, Anna is no longer free to enjoy the life of St. Petersburg. Even when she's invited to go to the theater with Princess Barbara, Vronsky warns her not to go. And when she insists on going anyway, she's insulted by a woman sitting next to her. In effect, then, she and Vronsky are driven from St. Petersburg, exiled to his country estate. And not even there can they flee all of their problems. So long as Anna rejects divorce, she cannot remarry, which means that her baby girl and any other children she has by Vronsky will legally belong to Karenin. Vronsky cannot bear this prospect. Since he very much wants a son and heir, he urgently wants Anna to get a divorce. So he asks Dolly, Anna's sister-in-law, to persuade Anna to write to Karenin and demand a divorce. But Anna holds her ground. She's furious at being snubbed by those who think her disrespectable, and to Dolly's amazement, she doesn't care about marrying Vronsky and legitimating their children because she plans to have no more of them. She knows, too, that divorce would mean losing her son, and if she can't have both her son and Vronsky, the rest makes no difference, she tells Dolly. It all makes no difference. These words prove prophetic. With or without divorce, Anna knows that she has lost her son, and soon enough begins to fear that she's losing Vronsky as well. Whenever he leaves her, whether for a few days or even a few hours, she turns resentful, suspicious, and profoundly fearful that he no longer loves her. When he has to go to Moscow, she insists on going with him, and she finally agrees to write Karenin for a divorce. But Karenin won't give her a divorce. Even when Oblonsky goes to see him and says that Anna has given up her claim to their son, Karenin won't budge. Anna's life with Vronsky in Moscow now turns sour. Waiting in vain to hear from Karenin, she blames Vronsky for all of her suffering, and in spite of his tender concern for her and his willingness to do anything she wants, she convinces herself that he loves someone else. At this point, she remembers what she felt when she nearly died right after the birth of her baby girl. The prospect of her death, she remembers, made her master of both men, and now real death would bring her a strange combination of redemption and vengeance. Yes, to die, she tells herself. The shame and disgrace of my husband and of my son and my own terrible shame, death will save it all. To die, and he, meaning Vronsky, will repent, pity, love, and suffer for me. So ultimately, Anna kills herself to punish Vronsky and to regenerate his love for her. She succeeds only too well, for death leaves Vronsky a broken man who can hardly wait to die himself. In the profoundly moral world of Tolstoy's novel, adultery is a crime for which Anna and Vronsky are punished not so much by society as by the sufferings they inflict on each other. So the regeneration of love that Anna sought to provoke in Vronsky must be sought elsewhere, in the lives of Kitty and Levin. After she is spurned by Vronsky, at the beginning of the novel, Kitty eventually decides to marry Levin. And the novel concludes with a touching picture of them and their infant son on Levin's farm. When a great oak crashes down in a thunderstorm one day, while Kitty and the baby and the nursemaid are out walking, Levin prays to God that it has not fallen on them. When his prayers are answered and he finds both his wife and his child safe, Levin discovers a new meaning in life, a new reason to live, the antithesis of the desperation that drove Anna to die. And in the final words of the novel, Levin seems to articulate not only his own faith, but the faith of Tolstoy himself. For throughout the 1870s, Tolstoy struggled to vanquish the despair that he felt in contemplating the inevitability of death. Something of this struggle comes through in Levin's words, the very last words of the novel. I fail, says Levin. I fail to understand with my reason why I pray. And yet I will pray. But my life now, my whole life, regardless of all that may happen to me, every minute of it is not only not meaningless as it was before, but has the unquestionable meaning of the good which I can put into it.